Dr. George Yatskievych, senior member of the staff of the Research, Science and Conservation Division, also called Research, here at the Missouri Botanical Garden, author of 3 volumes of Steiermark's Flora of Missouri, and a person who has a really wonderful perspective on plants and humans. George?
So, I'm a little concerned about this group. You say you're interested in biodiversity, so what do? You agree to be cooped up in a little room with the curtains drawn or closed and artificial light up on top, and okay, we'll see how interested in biodiversity you are. So, my thankless job tonight is to give you a little bit of historical perspective to kind of warm you up before the really good stuff happens. And I'm shameless that way. I can do the sort of easy stuff and let the other speakers do the harder, sort of more challenging concepts. What I'm going to do tonight is tell you a little bit about biodiversity from a historical perspective, show you some of the benchmarks and some of the people early on and maybe a little later, and then pepper you with a bunch of numbers that are both interesting to me as a botanist and depressing to you as people interested in biodiversity, and then we'll end on that note. And I should say that because I'm a botanist, I'll be speaking about biodiversity primarily from the plant perspective. Okay, so we know from the archaeologists that there's been a human presence in Missouri since before the close of the last ice age. Humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge and diffused rapidly through the Americas, and Missouri was thinly settled at that point, but the people who were here definitely made an impact on the environment, particularly in the form of fire. They were setting fires regularly to clear areas around their encampments. They were doing it to herd game for the slaughter, and they were doing it to improve the range so they didn't have to go so far to hunt. And this practice continued many, many thousands of years up until the point where settlers of European descent got dense enough that they didn't like having their houses and their farms and other things burned. The more recent thing that I put up here was that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch chose to remind us last Sunday that for a period of nearly 600 years, there was this huge center of population in the Mississippi River Valley right at what is now St. Louis. And this Mississippian mound building culture numbered, by some estimates, as many as 100,000 people. It was the largest population center in North America up until the 1800s or so, when some of our other cities started getting bigger. What's interesting about this from a biodiversity standpoint is that these people disappeared relatively quickly. And there have been a number of theories about why they chose to disband their culture. One of the main theories has been that they exhausted the natural resources close to home. They simply cut down all the trees, and they eventually got to the point where it's too much trouble to go far enough to get timber for firewood, to hunt animals, to do the various things that they needed to keep their culture happy. Now, that's not the only theory, but from a biodiversity standpoint, this is pretty telling. And what it means is that when Auguste Chouteau and his crew came to what's now St. Louis in 1764 and founded the city by making their little encampment there, they may have thought that this area looked like a wilderness, but in fact, it had had a human impact and a human imprint on it for many, many thousands of years before anybody ever really of European descent set up shop in this part of the world. Now, we know that the landscape in Missouri as a whole is vastly different than it used to be. And just to give you 2 examples, our grasslands have diminished greatly. About a third of the state in pre-settlement times was in prairie of one sort or another, and because of conversion to pastures and agriculture and urban areas and the whole gamut of things, we now have less than 0.5% remaining. And what's remaining isn't just one big block somewhere, it's lots of little postage stamp size parcels. So our grasslands, which are an important part of Missouri, have changed a lot in the last 200 years particularly, and the plants and animals that reside in those communities have similarly been affected. The story with our woodlands and forests is a little bit more complicated, but it has the same result. Prior to fire suppression by human settlers of European descent, there was an open character to at least the uplands in Missouri, where it was more park-like, with more prairie plants underneath the trees and not a closed canopy. Once the fires became suppressed, the canopies closed in. More trees came in and colonized. Succession took place. That was okay up until about 1890, when the timber companies finally made their way to Missouri and over a 30-year period cut down more than 95% of all the trees growing in the state for commercial purposes. That was followed by an attempt to create small farms on that deforested land, which led to elimination of about a third of our topsoil during the Dust Bowl era. The Dust Bowl didn't just affect Oklahoma and Texas, it affected particularly the Ozark portion of Missouri and to some extent the northern part. So the bottom line after all of this is that despite the fact that we have more forest in Missouri than we've had at any time in the last 10,000 years or so, present day, the character of that forest, that is, its structure and the species that are associated with it, have changed dramatically over time. Closer to home in the St. Louis area, we can thank Walter Schroeder, who's a geographer that was at the University of Missouri, who was interested in the spread of prairie in Missouri and mapped prairie using old land survey notes and other historical sources. And for the St. Louis area, Steve Buback, who used to manage the natural features of Forest Park, simply overlaid those on an aerial photograph of St. Louis. So you can see that at the time of Choteau and others, there was quite a lot of prairie in what is now St. Louis, more than half. And Schroeder went on then to look specifically at the developing city in the early 1800s and was able to show from old maps and things that there were large areas of prairie that remained that were common areas, that were common fields, where people who were living in the area could graze their animals, could get hay, and get other services from the prairie, even in the developing urban area. Now let's talk about science a little bit. Let's talk about how botany developed in Missouri. The first person on the Illinois side of the river, whoever really made observations on the plant life, a trained botanist, was this guy down here. I've got his name up on top. It's a guy named André Michaud. He was a famous French botanist who traveled broadly. Some reason or another, he couldn't figure out how to get across the river, so he was only up in the Belleville area in the 1790s. And he collected a few plants and then went about his way until eventually he got sick and died in 1802. But on the Missouri side of the river, the first scientific observations were those of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And in particular, Meriwether Lewis, who got training in botany from Barton, who was a famous botanist in Philadelphia before the expedition. We have these notes about the plant life. They also collected some specimens, but those specimens mysteriously disappeared after they were sent back east and have never been seen since. We have the bill of lading, and we just don't know what happened to them. So all we have is the published accounts of the expedition. What Lewis and Clark did, though, was pave the way for a number of expeditions that went up the Missouri River Valley to retrace their footsteps. Many of these expeditions were fur trading expeditions and otherwise motivated by economic development of the region, but they also, I guess they were charitable, allowed some botanists to go with them. So Thomas Nuttall and John Bradbury were the first to try this out, and they joined a fur trading expedition that left St. Louis in the spring of 1811. That winter and early spring before, they hung around St. Louis waiting for things to get ready and botanized. And among the things, for example, that Nuttall collected were these odd winged fruits in a glade area somewhere around town, which he then took back to England afterwards, grew in a nursery, and it, lo and behold, became the Missouri Evening Primrose, which he was the first to discover and first to describe as new to science. In that period, it became very popular in horticulture in Europe, long before Merv Wallace ever started selling it at Missouri Wildflowers Nursery and created sort of a renaissance for it. But at any rate, these are the first sort of detailed observations of the area. These were our first baseline, and they were very sketchy. These expeditions, by the way, continued well into the 1830s, and they all basically went up the Missouri River Valley to get somewhere else. So it's kind of like driving down Interstate 44 to get to Tucson or someplace like that. You drive through and you see stuff along the roadside, but you never really get immersed in it the way that you would if you were actually living in an area. The first guy to actually live in the area was a guy named Louis Caleb Beck. His brother was a lawyer in St. Louis, and from a period of 1820 to 1822, he spent a year and a half botanizing on both sides of the river. And I bring him up only because it was really cool to be a botanist back then. Plants like green trillium and cleft phlox and small ladies' tresses, things that we see in the environment now and kind of take for granted as common wildflowers, were entirely new to science in his era. He was the first person to actually write about them, to describe them, and to discover them. So it was an interesting time, one that's pretty much over for Missouri in the sense of that level of discovery. This is his original plant specimen from an herbarium of Monarda bradburyana, which he described and named after John Bradbury, the guy in the previous slide. And he wrote a series of publications based upon his 18 months in the area. And botany in Missouri grew out of that. But it didn't really take off until this gentleman, like his first name, George Engelmann, first came to the area around 1830. And he was a physician who came here from Germany, but he really liked plants. So as it turns out, he botanized extensively, both around town and throughout Missouri and elsewhere in the country for that matter. He became very well known as a botanist. He described over 600 species as new to science. His own personal herbarium was nearly 100,000 specimens. We have that here now. And he put Missouri on the map and St. Louis on the map as a center for botanical research. In part, this was because he became Henry Shaw's botanical advisor and the first research botanist at the Botanical Garden here when it opened in 1859. I will also mention that George Engelmann was great at mentoring and great at networking and great at education, which is one of the reasons why he decided that he really needed to invest time and effort into creating the Academy of Science of St. Louis. He was one of the founders, and in fact, the annual service award that the Academy gives is still named for him. So that was another great thing. He also was instrumental in starting the National Academy of Science. So he was a really important fellow, and he was here. So botany continued to thrive in Missouri, and particularly in the period of 1860s and 1870s, there were more and more botanists spending time not just in the Missouri River Valley, but elsewhere in the state. It wasn't until 2 years after Engelmann passed away, though, that the first attempt was made at a comprehensive catalog of all the plant life growing in Missouri. And this was a guy named Samuel Tracy, who was a professor at the University of Missouri. And that was our first benchmark of all the plant life that supposedly occurred in Missouri. And it wasn't until 1911 that members of the Engelmann Botanical Club did the first local checklist. So this is actually fairly recent stuff compared to when botany got started in the state. Another big milestone was E.J. Palmer's Catalogue of the Flora of Missouri, which was an expanded checklist. And what's important about Palmer, aside from the fact that he was a great botanist and that he was self-educated, he never finished high school, became a famous botanist, an authority on hawthorns among other things, worked for the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University for most of his career as a plant collector. But the thing we hold dear is that he mentored a young Julian Steiermark. Steiermark spent some time at Harvard, and there he met Palmer, and Palmer said, you know, you really ought to do this Flora Missouri stuff. And Steiermark went ahead and did that. Now, Julian Steiermark is a very well-known champion plant collector who worked on the flora of Missouri in his spare time while he was being paid to work on flora of Guatemala for the most part, and put out this huge tome, which was the first time that we had a book that not only listed the plants, but told you how to identify them and where they grew and what they looked like. And so this was a big advance in our understanding of Missouri plants. By the time that this book was published 50 years ago in 1963, Steiermark had already moved on to other things, and he spent most of the rest of his career working on Venezuelan plants in the Lost World region of southern Venezuela. Wasn't that cool? But what it did do was it provided a basis in 1987 for the current Flora of Missouri project, which the Missouri Botanical Garden and the Missouri Department of Conservation co-sponsored. there was a need for updated information, and by then his book had become somewhat dated. So this is a big door that these are holding up, and I will point out that that's a principal use for these books. You can remove one to look at it, and the remaining two will still hold the door open. We've developed an even bigger encyclopedia in response to people's demands for more information on the plant life, and in doing so have gotten more detailed information using tools like a computer that Steiermark never had available to him. The information comes from the same sources that Steiermark used. We use the existing museum specimens, that is, dried, pressed plant specimens with their associated labels from these museums called herbaria. We supplement that with information from the existing scientific literature, and then primary field studies where the fun part occurs, where you actually get to go out and interact with living plants. And those are all synthesized and condensed into these volumes, and we supplement it with other information about the plant, such as detailed descriptions that are done with a ruler and a microscope. That's the sort of boring part. And then we throw in tidbits, because this is supposed to be a sort of self-contained encyclopedia, on other things such as which are the poisonous plants and which are the ones that have some sort of uses. And there's a literature cited for people who might want more information than the books can contain. So what can we do with all this information we've collected? Well, the first thing we can do is we can use these various publications that I just reviewed, and we can plot a timeline of how many species we know to occur in Missouri during different time periods. And the take-home message from this is that regardless of whether you're dealing with the total flora or the native flora or the non-native flora, that curve is still going up. It is not flattened out. That means we have a reasonable expectation of continuing to find new and wonderful things growing in Missouri that we don't know about today, if we only bother to look. And so, for example, we know that plant distributions can change dramatically over a relatively short period. Some of the worst invasive exotics in the state today were not known to occur in Missouri in Steiermark's time. The bush honeysuckle that everybody's fighting in their yards, this is Kira's campus, by the way. They're doing valiant efforts to eradicate the honeysuckle there, but I got in ahead and took a picture. At any rate, this very, very abundant and very, very economically important plant, because it costs money to control it, was not known to occur in Missouri in 1963. It came in the 70s. Similarly, things like the autumn olive and the cutleaf teasel and the garlic mustard, those simply didn't exist in Missouri in 1963. They have migrated into the state in one way or another since that time. Among the native additions, some of them are simply very rare habitat specialists that were overlooked by previous botanists. But this Newland's blazing star, which has actually made its way into the native plant trade, is fairly widespread in Missouri, and it was just confused for another species. This is the biggest and showiest of the blazing stars, and it was actually first found as a distinct entity in Missouri at Weldon Springs, near here. We even have a couple of dozen species that were entirely new to science that have been described since Steiermark's original book. And they are in various families, and some of them are showy and some of them are very subtle, but still that's amazing for a mid-continental area with supposedly one of the best-known floras in the country. In order to keep track of all of this, we had to database information. And my database manager, Rex Hill, has for many years done a great job of helping me to provide tools to others to use the information on the plant biodiversity of the state. And so we have a catalog of all of the plant names associated with the flora, and we have specimen information from over 186,000 specimens of Missouri plants. That's not nearly all of them, but it's a good enough start that we can start summarizing some things about the flora. So, for example, we can ask, what is the county-by-county distribution of species and subspecies and varieties in the flora? Which counties have the champion? Well, it turns out St. Louis County has had more reported than any other county. That's probably because places that have a lot of botanical activity, such as Boone County, where the University of Missouri is, or Greene County, where Missouri State is, people tend to botanize close to home, and so those are better known counties. But what this also does is it points to holes in our sampling. So, for example, St. Charles County has a lot more things that need to be found at the county level to assess the biodiversity at that level than the surrounding counties. I don't know why that is. It's a historical artifact, but it points to a need. We can also talk about those things that are new to the state since the original Steiermark. What counties are they found in? Turns out there's at least one of those that's been reported from every county in the state. So you can find new things growing in Missouri pretty much anywhere you go. It's not just down in the Ozarks, and it's not just in the counties around the outside of the state, but pretty much anywhere. If you look hard enough, you will find something new and wonderful. We can also create checklists so that if we send somebody out to botanize in a particular county and they happen across a stand of garlic mustard in an urban woodlot, they can, and this is for the city of St. Louis, see whether or not garlic mustard has ever been reported. And so we can add to our information in sort of a logical way. The weakness of this approach is that the species level distributions that we compile are entirely the sum of all the historical localities. The oldest specimen collected in Missouri dates back to the early 1800s. The newest one was collected just a few weeks ago in terms of what we have in the museums and in our database, but we do not have the power to be able to say whether or not a given species on the St. Louis checklist is only known from some old herbarium specimen collected a long time ago, or whether we can find a place to find living plants on the landscape right now. Another way to look at this is we can say from the database, what is the last year that a species has been collected in a given geographic area? So this is St. Louis County and City, and we put this together, and what we found was that in the city, we presently have in the database that many 2,060 some odd species based on 11,000 specimens. But what we find is if we arbitrarily say, let's say the end of the 1970s, more than half of those 2,000 species have not been seen in St. Louis City or County by any botanist in the last 35 years. Well, 33 and almost 34 years. So what this does is it's fairly depressing. It says we've accumulated a lot of information that is a good tool for people to use in assessing biodiversity, but we're not there yet. And the important thing is that we do not know how to deal with these present-day distributions, so we can't assess trends. We can't really say which species have declined. Now, some of them we can, obviously, the big showy things, but many of the species potentially will fall through the cracks for conservation planning purposes simply because we don't have detailed enough information to contrast the old distribution with where they are now. And without this knowledge, we can't really track species for decline and increase in their populations, and therefore things like the Missouri Natural Heritage Program have a certain level of imprecision in them that we really need to work hard to overcome to really understand what the conservation status of our flora is. How do we do this? Well, it's fairly straightforward. First off, we need to get in there with our computers and we need to capture the information on the rest of the historical specimens that are in those various museums that have Missouri collected holdings. But more pertinent to this group, we need to do more inventories actually on the ground now to determine the status of species in Missouri today. Not 1890s or 1830s, but our decade. Because that's the only way we can really get a sense of what our biodiversity is in this urban area. And that's going to take a lot more eyes and hands. We also, because I've been talking about museum specimens and that's sort of the hardline approach, need to come up with new ways of capturing information in addition to the specimen-based information so that we can include information on photographs or anecdotal reports so that when the Webster Groves Nature Study Society goes out and has a field trip, we can keep track of the checklists that they generate, and that's going to be a whole nother level of undertaking. So I am cautiously optimistic that a group like Biodiversity St. Louis can really take over and run with this. And I will say that what I've talked about for plants holds true of most other groups of organisms. The exception perhaps is birds, where there's this huge interest among the amateur community, and there's been a breeding bird atlas done and Christmas bird counts going back to many, many years ago. So birds we have a leg up on, but do you know what the distribution of toads in the St. Louis area is? What about beetles? You know, there's hundreds and thousands of them. So what I'm saying for plants in many ways only gets worse for these other types of organisms. And now that I've suitably depressed you, I'm going to finish Thank you.